Demon Kissed, Chapter 12. "Sleep," I said again, closing my eyes and folding my hands behind my head on the pillow. I felt her snuggle up to my side, place a hand on my stomach, and lay her head on my chest a moment later. "Comfortable?" I asked in amusement, and opened one eye to look down at her. Erin nodded slowly, yawned again, then mumbled, "Night, Zach," and fell asleep a second later. I moved one hand from behind my head and reached down to stroke her hair gently. It was soft and long, and as black as the space between stars. I noticed that she had split ends and made a mental note to trim it for her when she was feeling better. I'd normally feel about as comfortable lying next to a woman as a sinner in a church, but for some reason I felt relaxed as I lay next to Erin, and the only thing that came to mind as an explanation before I, too, fell asleep was that she truly was like a sister to me. Some time later I was awoken by the door opening and the sound of a low chuckle. My eyes snapped open to the misty light of twilight, and I swiftly scanned the darkening room without moving more than my eyes. Over in the doorway I saw Alistair's shadowed form, and lifted the hand behind my head in greeting. Erin was still sound asleep with her head on my chest, and my fingers were a bit tangled in her hair. Smiling slightly, I carefully moved her off of me and laid her back on her own pillow. She murmured sleepily and snuggled into the pillow. I slipped off the bed and padded quietly toward the door, scrubbing my hands through my coarse, shoulder-length hair as I went. Alistair moved back from the doorway as I came to it and gave me a slightly fanged grin before reaching around me and pulling the door closed. "Evening, Dad," I said, and grinned when he grimaced at me. "Demon brat," he said, and gestured toward the stairs, indicating that I should precede him. "You do realize that phrase is not an insult to me, right?" I said, and heard him hiss at me like a cat as we descended the stairs. Grinning like the demon I was, I jogged down the steps 2 at a time and reached the large entrance foyer before he did. I paused for a moment to stretch out the stiff muscles of my back and take a deep breath through my nose. I smell something amazing," I said on a sigh as he stepped off the last stair to stand beside me, and he laughed when my stomach growled like a bear. "Come to the dining room and we will feed you, brat," he said, and pushed me in that direction. As we walked down the long hall toward the dining room, we passed several people who waved or called out evening greetings, and I returned them with a smile. "Gods, it's good to be home again," I said half sarcastically after returning Lucian's rather rude gesture of greeting with one of my own, and getting a loud bark of laughter from him in response. Shaking my head, I entered the open double doors to the dining room and continued speaking. "You have no idea how good it really is to be home, Alistair." "You could have returned to us at any time," he said pointedly, and sat in the chair at the head of the table. I followed him and took the seat on his left. "No, I couldn't. Not until it was time for me to come back," I said, spreading a linen napkin on my lap and looking around the room. Big and airy, it had a long black walnut sidebar along one wall, 2 floor-to-ceiling stained-glass windows, and 4 tall, glass-fronted curio cabinets that held a variety of glasses, plates, and porcelain figurines. The north wall had a big field-stone fireplace, and in pride of place above the mantel in a gold frame was the portrait of a beautiful blood-red-haired, sea-green-eyed woman, wearing a dark green tunic, leather vest, and breeches, sprawled in a throne-like chair with one leg thrown over one chair arm, smirking and holding a long, jeweled dagger in her left hand. The vaulted ceiling sported a huge crystal chandelier that cast sparkling light on the table, reflecting off of the wide-bowl wine glasses and fine china plates in little rainbow showers of light. The walls were painted hunter green with cherry wood wainscoting, and fine black scroll work ran in spider thread fine lines that resembled fire over the bare walls to either side of the fireplace. My gaze returned to the painting, and I felt a dull ache in the region of my heart as I looked on nearly forgotten facial features. It's been centuries since she died in battle, but I still can't believe she's gone, I murmured, dragging my gaze back to the table and the master vampire sitting quietly next to me. None of us can truly believe that Lay is gone. I sometimes look at that painting and believe that she will just step out of it and laugh like she used to, Alistair said, a sad, wistful note in his voice and his eyes on the painting. I looked back at the picture and could have sworn I heard her saying, with her thickly Scots-accented voice, that time just kept moving in complete disregard for the lives of those lost and left behind. I remembered her saying that once, after a battle, and I remembered that she had looked around her at the grim-faced warriors gathered around her, and laughed, then said, "If you lads want to live long and die free, you need to train more with me and learn all you can." Then she had led us back home and trained us into the courtyard dirt, laughing every time she put us on our asses and telling us that we'd never live as long as we would like if we didn't try harder to put her on her ass on the ground. She was a crazy woman with a backbone of steel and more skill in battle than sense, I mused, smiling at the memory and looking back at Alistair. His grey eyes glittered with unshed tears, and there was a faint, sad smile on his lips. She had more sense than she let anyone see, Iresilian, and more courage than many men I had known before or since I met her, he said, none of the emotion I could see on his face showing in his voice, and turned his head to look at me. There are times, boy, that I can still feel her hand on my shoulder and hear her voice sharing some amusing thing she had heard or seen or done, he added, and reached to run his finger along the stem of his empty wine-glass. She was a strong, shining light to us all, a deep, thickly Russian voice said behind me, and both Alistair and I jumped at the sound. "Nikolai," I said in greeting, as the tall, wiry man moved from behind me and took a seat on Alistair's right. "How are Gregorio and Yuri?" I asked, in reference to the other two behemoth Russians that normally followed after him like giant shadows. "Eh, they are fine, dear Issy. And you? You are well, yes?" he said, pulling a tall bottle of Russian vodka out of his inside coat pocket and filling his water-glass with it. "Yes, I am well," I said, and grinned when he nodded and drank the entire glass down in one swallow, then proceeded to refill it. Out of the corner of my eye I saw Alistair shaking his head in amused disapproval. "The times and places may change, but my people remain as they have always been," whispered through my mind, and I looked over at Alistair to see a faint grin tilting his lips as he watched Nikolai fondly as he again refilled his glass. The swinging door to the kitchen opened, and 3 women entered carrying large covered silver trays. 2 of the women were arguing loudly, and the third was shaking her head and appeared to be trying not to laugh at them. "You 2 harpies stay the hells out of my kitchen, or I swear I will put you in a pot and make you into stew," proceeded the form of a shortish, stout, dark-skinned Cajun man, carting a giant pot of what smelled like burned-the-church-down hot shrimp gumbo in one hand and waving a ladle with the other. "Good evening, Cookie," I said, interrupting him before he could launch any more threats at the women, who were now placing the trays on the table and removing the covers. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, and grinned. Auguste Lorette was 5 feet 9 inches of good down-to-earth Cajun blood, and it showed. His skin was a brown so dark it appeared to be black, and his black curly hair had blue highlights in it. His dark eyes twinkled with good humor, and his teeth gleamed bright white against his dark skin as he smiled. "You been gone too long, Cher," he said, and set the pot gently on the in the center of the table. "I had to leave, Cookie. You know that," I said, and reached to lift the lid off of the pot. He smacked my hand with the ladle and tisked at me. "I know no such thing. You could 'a' stayed right here and still done what you needed to for that girl," he said, and lifted the pot lid, then continued speaking as he began ladling gumbo into bowls. "You been missin' my cookin' out there in the ruins of this city, but do you come home, even to just say hey? No. You stay out there, eatin' God knows what, and gettin' thin." He placed the now completely full bowl on the table in front of me, and I exchanged a small amused smile with the petite, blonde woman handing him bowls and shaking her head. "Good evening, Aunt Colette," I said, and her smile widened into a grin. "Good evening, Eracilion. Did you sleep well?" she said, her softly French-accented voice lilting and gentle. At 4 feet 10 inches in height, she remained one of the smallest people I knew. Her facial features were a more delicate, feminine version of Alistair's sharply chiseled, aristocratic features, and marked them as blood relatives. A lady in every sense of the word, she radiated grace and gentleness from the top of her blonde head to the soles of her tiny feet. "Yes, I did. Thank you. I apologize for not coming downstairs before now. The last 6 days have been trying, to say the least," I said, and her almost colorless blue eyes narrowed slightly. "You have no need to apologize to us, Eracilion. We understand what it is like to worry for one who refuses to be protected," she said, her tone gentle. The look she directed at Cookie, however, was not. "You didn't forget about me, did you, Riss?" A low female voice that was slightly flavored with the Outback said from beside me, and I turned my head to see the speaker. I knew who she was and what she was. More, I knew who she was to me, and I just couldn't resist messing with her. It was, after all, a big brother's job to tease the crap out of their little sisters. "Who are you again?" I asked, the red-haired, amber-eyed, athletic woman teasingly. "Riss, why are you teasing me? We haven't seen each other in 10 years," she said, and pouted. I smiled, reached up, and pulled her down onto my lap. "How are you, Malira?" I asked, and tweaked the end of her nose. "I'm fine. How's your friend?" she asked, and I heard something in her tone when she said fine that made the word not ring quite true. "Aaron is doing good. What's bugging you? I know the sound of that fine, so don't lie," I said, and started to eat around her. She smacked my shoulder, grabbed my bowl off of the table, and held it for me before I could drop any food on her white shirt. "Thank you, my dearest baby sister. Now out with it. What's bothering you?" I said. "It's silly, really. Tell you later?" she said, getting up from my lap and putting my bowl back. "Sure, if I'm still awake. I'm still pretty beat. But you have to tell me, Malira," I said, and looked toward the door where her attention had wandered before she stood. She nodded, shot one more look at the doorway, and made a hasty exit through the kitchen door. The only person in the doorway was Aaron's brother, Graham, and he was staring after her like a man whose goal had just slipped through his grasp. I looked over at Alistair and raised one eyebrow in question. He gave me wide eyes, shook his head, and made a push-away gesture. "Isaac," Graham said, taking the chair next to mine. "Graham, good evening. How are you?" I said, and took a bite of some of the hottest gumbo in the world. It was also the best gumbo in the world. I knew this for a fact. I'd traveled far and wide to try and find the one gumbo that would beat Cookies, and couldn't find it anywhere. "How is my sister recovering?" Graham asked, and reached for Nikolai's bottle of vodka. I stared at him wide-eyed, then stared at Nikolai with equally wide-eyed intensity when he simply handed the bottle over with a smile. A smile, for the gods' sakes! If there had ever been one absolute truth that I could rely on, it was that Nikolai Voroslav never shared his vodka with anyone, not even his brothers, and yet that one very reliable fact in my life had just been destroyed. Amazing. "How did you get him to do that?" I asked in amazement, and Graham chuckled. "It was easy. I bought the bottle," he said, and handed the nearly empty bottle back. I finished eating and sat back in my chair, just watching the other people in the room. Over the course of the last half an hour, more of the people that called the mansion home had filtered in and sat at the table around me. Some had said hello, others had merely grunted in greeting, and more than a few had asked after Erin, curious about her recovery and whether or not we would be staying once she was fully healed. To most of the questions of whether we'd be leaving or not, I said that I didn't know, but that I'd like to stay. To others, I just said it was up to Erin and the kids, which received more than a few groans, and one, "What are you, a pet?" from Valor Mallory. I gave him a one-fingered salute, and he walked off mumbling under his breath. Alistair had been in one conversation after another, sometimes arguing, sometimes agreeing, and other times just listening to the person he was speaking to and nodding or shaking his head. The boisterous atmosphere in the dining room reminded me of times long past, when Leigh was still alive, and members of the guild were coming in from jobs or just heading out on them and getting last-minute orders. Only this was different. The people were the same, the conversation remained loud and mixed up, the laughter was still infectious, and the teasing of some members by others was still intense. But the room was too small for the many people trying to get their dinner. Alistair was the boss, and there were several faces missing from the crowd, several voices missing from the many conversations going on around me, and I found myself longing for the days before cars were the main form of transportation, before electricity, before humanity had taken over the planet, and when the religion of Christianity was still just the wish of a few heretic Jews. I longed for the days when Leigh was alive and everyone was still living together in one place. I longed for the times that would never be again. The long days of weapons training out by the lock, the even longer nights out on jobs tracking down and eliminating deviant vamps, shifters, and wares. The long battle strategy talks I overheard between Nick, Alistair, Armando, and Leigh about troop placement and retreat points. I let out a deep, heartfelt sigh and pushed back from the table. "Irisilion, a moment, please," Alistair said, stopping me beside his chair, and I waited while he finished his conversation with my younger adopted brother, David. "Come," Alistair said finally, standing as David left him and motioning for me to follow as he led the way out of the dining room and into the hallway. "You seem rather withdrawn this evening," he said, leading me back down the hall to his office. I stopped in the doorway and watched him glide across the room to the desk, where he turned to prop his hip on one corner and regard me quizzically with his arms crossed. "I do not think I have ever seen you so quiet, and I find myself wondering at the cause," he said, and sighed when I remained standing silent in the doorway, watching him. "Come in, close the door, and sit down, Irisilion," he said after a few beats of silence, his voice tired. I hesitated for a moment, then did as I was told and closed the door behind me before crossing to the chair in front of the desk and sitting. "As you know, I find myself in a difficult situation at present. I would like your help in finding a solution for it," he said, and moved around the desk to the heavy bookcase on the wall beside it. He pressed something on it. There was a soft click, and the top shelf swung upward, revealing a hidden compartment. From the compartment he pulled down an old record player and a large box. A large, black, leather-bound book fell off of the hidden shelf and hit the wood floor with a solid thump, landing on its spine and opening to the middle section. I couldn't read the words written within from where I was sitting, and Alistair didn't seem to notice that it had fallen as he fiddled with the player. "Kill the bitch," I said as I stood, and moved around the desk to retrieve the book. Picking it up carefully, I added, "It's what Leigh would have told you to do." I carefully turned a page and studied the words, gently fingering the edge as I did. I noted that it was made of vellum and very old. The script was old, faded, and worn, but still readable. The words were written in a delicate, firm female hand and seemed to flow across the page in a way that was as familiar to me as my own reflection, and seemed to detail the writer's day and the people in it. A diary or journal, then. That was her solution to nearly every problem she encountered, except for Nick and Lucian, he said, then made a sound of triumph as the strains of this magic moment began to play. "It was effective," I said absently as I began to truly read the book. "May I keep this for a while?" I asked after a moment, looking over at him. "Keep what?" he asked, turning to look at me. When he saw the book in my hands, he smiled sadly and took it from me. He stared at the words for long minutes, and he gently ran a finger down the page, then closed the book. He smoothed his hand over the cover before nodding and handing it back to me. "There are others in there, if you would like to read them as well," he said, gesturing at the compartment. "Nick has most of the rest of the collection with him in that monstrosity he calls home near the dome," he added. "Who has the rest?" I asked as I reached into the compartment for the other 3 books, wondering who had the ones relating how Leigh had actually come to find me. Leather-bound and heavy, the books had no title on either the cover or spine. Instead, they had the same silver embossed design on the front depicting a hand, a large tree with its limbs widespread, and 7 stars. Other than Nick, Arazul, Merrick, and Lorenzo have the others. We brought many with us when we came here, but we left many more behind in Scotland in Jarrick's care, and we try not to keep them all in one place at one time," he said, moving to the chair behind the desk and sitting down. I nodded. It made sense to keep the books separate, as they seemed to contain details about us all, and I could think of no one better to protect them than the Djinn. These, in particular, contained details about Alistair and 2 other people I had never met. "How many are there?" I asked, studying the design. It was beautifully rendered, with amazing detail. The hand seemed to be holding the tree, the fingers curving around the trunk, and the tree seemed to hold the stars suspended at the top of the cover. "Over 900, he said, and I stared at him for a moment. "That many? What did she do, write everything down?" I asked, amazed. "Yes, she did. There would have been more. However, I could not locate the ones containing the 25 years that she was out of contact with her family and myself, nor could I find the ones pertaining to her 19-year stay in Ferry," he said, and sighed. "Ask Nick. If anyone would know about those years, it would be him," I said, returning to the desk and placing the books on the top in front of me before retaking my seat. "What makes you think that?" he snapped, sitting forward, and the look in his eyes was a bit frightening in its intensity. I slowly sat back in my chair. "He and Leigh were blended. Mentally, I mean," I said slowly after a moment, and he nodded. "When the blending occurred, they gained mannerisms and ways of speaking from each other. The most notable result of that was that Nick remained sane and rational. I said. I know all of this already. What does it have to do with the missing years? He said, interrupting me. I was getting to that, if you'd let me finish, I said, and he nodded. As I said, that was the most notable result. The less noticeable one was that she was less sane and rational than she had been. She was more willing to kill without question, more inclined to maim, torture, and kill her enemies than she was before. Nick was more inclined to let them be until they proved too dangerous to let them live, and even then he just killed them. When Nick's sanity was slipping, she would lose all rationality, not eating or sleeping, or she would just go quiet for days. She would attack anyone or anything that came near her, and Nick was the only one that could get near her without being attacked at those times. The blending forged a bond between them that allowed him to track her when we couldn't find her, and allowed her to do the same. During the blending, when they met, they briefly shared one mind, and they exchanged memories as well as blood, I said, then paused to gather my thoughts. That was very nearly the death of her, rather than a blood exchange. But it does not explain what all of this has to do with the missing scrolls, he said into the brief silence. Does it not? I asked rhetorically, then continued. Think, Alistair. Nick has those memories. He knew Leigh better than anyone else, both mentally and emotionally, I said, leaning forward in my seat and locking my gaze with his. He leaned back in his seat away from me and regarded me for several moments, then nodded slowly. What you say explains so much about their relationship and puts a new light on what happened after. His voice trailed off, and I nodded, remembering a month and a half of batshit crazy bloodshed and needless destruction. As to your traitor, kill her, Alistair. Kill her, bury her, and forget about her, I said after a moment, and leaned back in my chair. I know that killing her is the only way to ensure that what happened nearly 3 months ago does not happen again. However, I'm reluctant to just execute her without first learning the true why behind what she did, he said, and leaned forward again. Does the reason really matter? I asked. To me, it does. Besides, I have received a report from Melira earlier today, confirming my suspicions of where she ran to, he said. I would question his sanity over sending my sister out on her own to gather information later. For now, I needed to hear what she found out. What did she find? I asked. Sarah is in Inner City and under Master Marlowe's protection. I can get past Marlowe easily enough. His power is no match for mine. But I need to take backup of some sort with me in order to get in and out of the court safely, he said, and something in his eyes made dread skitter down my spine and settle low in my gut. You could take Luke or Mondo, or hell, Nick, for backup, I said, naming 3 of the most powerful vampires I knew of in the city. But Alistair shook his head, and the dread turned into a wave of fear that washed like ice through my blood. You could take Merrick or Nikolai or me, I said, and again he shook his head. The ice in my blood solidified. No. In order for me to make it in and out of the court safely, I need to bring a human with me and 3 others. I need a human that will be able to defend themselves from one of us if it comes down to a fight. I can bring 1 other master-level vampire into the court with me, and I intend to ask Nick to accompany me, he said, and I closed my eyes. I so had not seen this coming, I thought ironically. You need Aaron, you mean, I said, and looked at him. I would prefer it were not so, but yes, as I said, I need a human who can protect themselves in a fight if a fight is the only option left to get out of Inner City alive. he said. "You're crazy," I snapped, and stood from my chair to pace the room. "Absolutely out of your mind, batshit fucking nuts. You can't take her into the court. She's not trained in our politics, Alistair. She'll be killed the second she opens her mouth." "Do you honestly think that I have not thought of this?" he demanded, suddenly appearing in front of me. "Do you think that, for one damn second, that thought has not tortured me with terror all day? Do you think that I would bring her to danger if I could avoid it? That I would willingly risk her life if there were any other way?" His voice was low and laced with his power. Rage had turned his eyes crimson, and his fangs had lengthened with it, and his original accent had returned with a vengeance. The French was so thick that it would have been hard to understand him if I hadn't seen him this pissed off on more than one occasion. I stepped back and turned toward the windows behind the couch. Alistair continued to speak, but I couldn't hear him. I stared at the windows, not truly seeing them, the curtains that covered them, or the couch in front of me. All I could see were scenes from the vision I'd had 2 nights ago replaying in my mind over and over again. Erin being attacked from above, Erin laying in a widening pool of blood, her hand reaching out for someone or something as her eyes glassed over in death. I felt myself falling as the scenes changed and a new vision took its place. "Shit!" I growled, and completely lost my awareness of the here and now as the vision took hold of my mind and I was transported somewhere, somewhen else.